Now, I mentioned CPAC earlier. It's brought all sorts of people over here to Australia. We will have Nigel Farage on Outsiders on Sunday. But right now, here and now, I'm delighted to welcome to Credlin the one and only Mark Meadows. He's a North Carolina congressman, good friend of Donald Trump's, and he's out here in Australia speaking at the CPAC conference. And he's about to go on a harbour cruise, but we grabbed him first. Mark Meadows, welcome to Credlin.
It's great to be with you, and it's always great to be with fellow like-minded people here in Australia. The hospitality has been incredible, but it's also, I got to watch you last night, and I must confess, you remind me of Tucker Carlson on Fox News from the United States, so bravo.
Well, Mark, you can come back any time. I won't argue with that one. I love it. I love Tucker. He's fantastic. Now, we've had quite a few Americans in town. There must be something we're doing right here in Australia. We had Mike Pompeo here last week. Terrific. Peter Credlin interviewed him. Now, Mark, he was very keen to talk about the unbreakable bond between Australia and the US. Give us your thoughts on that, and hopefully also Donald Trump's thoughts on that.
Well, I can tell you, Secretary Pompeo was exactly right. It's an unbreakable bond. It's a bond that not only has existed for decades, but will continue to exist in the future. And I know when I was speaking to the president, telling him that I was coming here to address the folks at CPAC Australia, he had a message for the Australian people, and that is to let you know that he's looking forward to hosting your prime minister here in just a few weeks in the United States, but believes that the direction of your country is certainly one that needs to be applauded. So I'm here to kind of reinforce that message and say thank you for being a great ally and friend of the United States.
So, Mark, tell us, I've never been to a state dinner, and I gather that they're few and far between, and Scott Morrison, Australia, in fact, is very honoured. I think it's Donald Trump's, it's only his second state dinner. What is a state dinner like? Tell us a little bit about it. What's it involve? What's the protocol? What's on the menu?
well, I don't know what's on the menu because Melania Trump will decide that. The First Lady will decide that. But I can tell you that it is an honor that is reserved really for only the best friends of our country. It's certainly, as you mentioned, just the second state dinner that is being conducted. The President and the First Lady are looking forward to it. And as we look at hosting that for the Prime Minister, hopefully it carries a message, even in a difficult time right now with the trade issues that we're having with China, and I know that that's impacting a lot of people here. There's a lot of nervousness here in Australia, but it is really a testament of the bond that Secretary Pompeo talked about. But it is, it is certainly the hardest ticket to get in Washington, D.C., and so it will be a great honor. I look forward to joining your Prime Minister in September.
Fantastic. Now, Mark, you mentioned Mike Pompeo and China. Mike Pompeo had a line when he spoke here in Sydney the other day, on Sunday, in answer to a question about, I guess, the West, America, Australia and other countries being a bit asleep at the wheel as regards the various economic and potentially military threats China poses. He had his answer was that you could sell your soul for a can of soya beans, which I thought was pretty impressive. And he was talking about the idea that, yes, we have this terrific trade relationship. We all make money out of China, hopefully, but we've got to be aware of the strings that come with that. We had today Andrew Hastie, one of our MPs, wrote an article basically raising the threat of China. What's your point of view specifically as regards China, as regards the threat, as regards business relationships?
Well, probably the biggest thing that I see is obviously they're a world economic power. They're a great trading partner for Australia, but for the United States as well. They're an important part of the economy. But it's more important that we have fair trade and that we have it based on free markets. And as you know, China has, for many decades now, not only manipulated their currency, but they've created a situation where some of that economic back and forth is not based on sound capitalist principles. And ultimately, that's going to hurt the worker here in Australia, the worker back home in the United States. So the president is very resolved on making sure that with President Xi, that that he sets forth really a reset to say that we want trade, we welcome trade, but at the same time, what we're going to have to do is make sure it's done on a norm for a global norm that will not threaten our national security or our economic security.
Now, Mark, I also want to chat to you about climate change. You've spoken frequently on climate change. In fact, you encouraged Donald Trump to set up an investigation to look at it, which I think is a terrific idea. I've always said, let's actually get to what the science is about, not what we keep being told the scientists say. Let's actually look at the science and find out what is happening around climate change. Now, give us an idea, firstly, of what Donald Trump's response was to that and to your idea of setting it up. And how likely it is that we could see some kind of shift in global mentality away from this climate change cult to a more realistic assessment of what is actually going on with the planet.
Well, I think the president is right to focus on the science. You mentioned the science and making sure that we do that. And sometimes we see a lot of these left-wing extremists go well beyond what is really science to make the alarms. I think even on last night's program, you had someone saying that we should do away with all infrastructure in Australia and yet support that same infrastructure in Africa. I don't see how that actually advances the cause. And so I can tell you what it is in the United States. I bet it's the same here in Australia. It's about making sure that those hardworking taxpayers, whether they be in Australia or the United States, get to keep their job. And sometimes what we do, especially with the coal industry that you have here, the exports that you have, are we going to sacrifice good working jobs in exchange for a theory that's not proven by science? So I'm all in about making sure that we have the scientific basis. The president is there, and yet we all want clean air, we all want clean water, but candidly, some of the hyperbole that we see is just beyond the pale. And when we see people actually gluing themselves to the road, as has happened here, or in the Capitol, they were actually gluing themselves to the door jambs to keep us from getting to votes. I mean, those are kind of extreme measures that don't match with the science that's there.
Mark, there's a wonderful bit of footage of a guy in London trying to figure out how to glue himself to a revolving door, which he doesn't succeed. But listen, it was, for many of us, it was really reassuring when Donald Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement, because the problem I have, as I was talking about there, as regards the airline industry, because they've demonized coal to the point where, I'm sure it's the same in the States, but it's certainly here, you have so-called ethical investors, particularly left-wing universities and the like, saying, oh, we're not going to invest in coal. So the thing becomes self-fulfilling. If they start doing that to the airlines, we're just going to see airline prices going up. We're going to have taxes, more taxes put on airlines. Those prices will go up. For a country like Australia, this is insanity. We rely on, Qantas. All of us love Qantas and travel the world on Qantas. Qantas is called the spirit of Australia. Without Donald Trump pulling out of Paris, the rest of the world just seems to be happy to go along with this whole idea. Is there any effort from the Trump administration to try and encourage other like-minded or hopefully common-sense leaders to start withdrawing a little bit from the whole Paris commitment?
Well, I think there is, as you know, major pushback that you get, because the minute that the president withdrew from the Paris Accords, he was all demonized as if he didn't want clean air or clean water, and nothing could be further from the truth. What he wanted to do is make sure that we base it, one, on science, but the other is that we don't give competing economies an unfair advantage. That particular one, if we look at China and some of the other emerging countries in Africa, they didn't have the same standards that Australia or the United States would have. And so we've made an encouragement to make clean air and clean water a priority, but at the same time not do it at the expense of the hardworking workers across our countries. Now, you mentioned for Australia, it creates a real problem, as a country that is surrounded by water, and you do away from air travel, or you tax it in such a way that only the very wealthy can travel by air. It's a real problem, not just for Qantas as a company, but really for all those that that love freedom. And so hopefully we'll start to see that. We'll start to see a more pragmatic approach to addressing our climate issues. And the president was right to stand firm, and I applaud him in that.
Mark, I find one of the great con jobs is that they conflate things like plastics, which are a pollution, plastics in the sea and so on. They conflate that with pollution, so filth and soot and garbage up in the air, with carbon dioxide. They conflate all these things, which is a complete misnomer because, of course, countries, as you said, like China, are busy genuinely polluting. You can't breathe in places like Beijing, and yet they're allowed to get away with it, whereas cleaner countries like ours and yours are demonised simply for having carbon dioxide emissions, which strikes me as extraordinary. But I want to ask you about what I think is a terrific, it sounds like a great rock group or something, Bojo, ScoMo and Trump. I mean, it's the new triumvirate, if you like. You've got Boris Johnson in the UK, you've got Scott Morrison here, and of course Donald Trump. The three of them seem to have certain elements in common. They seem to get on well. Is this a kind of new era in a Australia, British, Anglosphere, I guess you could call it? Is this a new era?
Well, I think it is a new era. It's one based on a great relationship that existed prior to that. But with new leadership, as you know, with your prime minister, there's a natural affection that the president wanted me to communicate to the prime minister, saying that he looks forward to not only hosting him, but also seeing what he does with his government as he puts forth. There was a referendum, as you well know. There was a climate referendum on your previous vote, and yet conservatives came out across the board and said, listen, I want to make sure that I take care of my family. I want to make sure that my children have a better life than I do. And when you start to focus on those conservative values and those that the Western democracies have held true, then what happens is that it normally goes well for your economic development. So we're going to see that, I believe, in Australia and the UK and the United States, a strengthening of those relationships as we move forward.
And Mark, just very briefly, before I let you go off on your harbour cruise in a second, but speaking of being on the water, just very briefly, the Strait of Hormuz, so the idea that there could be protecting shipping lanes there, Australia, British, American vessels there, your thoughts on that?
Well, I can tell you that when we look at those shipping lanes, those are critically important, not just of the flow of fossil fuels, but really for freedom. And this president has been firm in his resolve to make sure that the Iranians, as they engage in those particular areas, that those really trespasses are not overlooked. There's one thing I can tell you about this president. He is willing to keep his word and stand firm with his allies. And so as we look at that, that's very problematic. I don't see it escalating into anything that is great from a military conflict. But the president is very resolved in making sure that we keep those straits open for commerce. And he'll do that.
Mark Meadows, Congressman from North Carolina, Republican, thanks so much for being on Credlin this evening, and enjoy the rest of your time in Sydney.
It's great to be with you. Thanks so much.